Right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Liz Fernandez with Professional People Training, and I'd like to welcome you to the Movement Decision Criteria on Public Lands during an FAD outbreak. We're excited to be able to present this NADPRP webinar for everyone, and we have a bunch of different speakers that are going to be actually speaking to you about this project. So we're going to start out with Dr. Julia Herman, National Cattlemen's Beef Association. And then we have Caitlin Glover from the Public Lands Council. We have Erica Stanko, American Sheep Industry Association, and Dr. JJ Goya, and Dr. Don Beckett, who is in absentia, and we have someone that's going to give his comments. And with that, I'm going to turn the webinar over to Julia Herman.
Thank you, Liz. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you here. This project has been going on for a couple of years, and we are really excited to provide some deliverables to you today. I am Julia Herman, the Beef Cattle Specialist Veterinarian with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. I do education and outreach and veterinary outreach for our producer education team, but one of the areas that I focus on is biosecurity. So I'm here representing the beef industry on this project. So we saw a real need for livestock owners who are grazing public land. So during the development of the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan, there was a gap identified with respect to these sheep grazing public land allotments. The same gap exists in the Secure Beef Supply Plan, and in neither of these plans, the public land allotments were not really addressed in any detail. So can you guys not hear me?
No, we can hear you fine.
Okay. Excellent. So when control areas encompass part or all of a public land allotment in one or more states, there are unique challenges that the sheep and the cattle owners have to mitigate these disease exposure risks. There was not funding nor time within the cooperative agreement year to further explore the complexities and provide actionable details. So that leads us to this project. So ASI and NCBA collaborated to submit a proposal to USDA NADPRP, and we began work on this in February of 2022. Our project name is Developing Movement Decision Criteria and Exercising Movement Plans for Livestock Grazing Public Land Allotments in and around FAD control areas through collaboration with industry, state, and federal partners. ASI subcontracted with Dr. Danelle Bickett-Weddle of Preventalytics to carry out the deliverables, and she was a valuable member of our team. So many of you have already or have likely studied foot and mouth disease already, but just a little background. Foot and mouth disease, or FMD, while harmless to people, causes blisters in animals with cloven hooves, or those two-toed animals such as sheep, cattle, pigs, and goats. It is the most contagious viral disease of livestock, and there is no treatment. This is not a public health or a food safety concern we really want to highlight. So when normal people, I just said it's not a public health concern. Normal appearing cattle can shed foot and mouth disease virus in bodily fluids like saliva, urine, milk, and even semen 2 to 4 days before clinical signs appear. In pigs, the same ways of shedding can occur in all of their bodily fluids. When we get to sheep, there's not so much breath or aerosol shedding, but it can contaminate raw wool. And it's also important to note that adult sheep may never show clinical signs. They're really good at hiding if they do happen to have foot and mouth disease. In addition to those livestock species, FMD affects over 70 species of wild artiodactyls. These even-toe species commonly found in North America that have been naturally infected and or experimentally infected with foot and mouth disease include American bison, white-tailed deer, feral pigs, elk, mule deer, and pronghorn antelope. Foot and mouth disease virus has also been reported to infect a few other species that may be found on federal public lands in the West, such as brown bears and grizzly bears. And a reminder that horses are not susceptible to foot and mouth disease virus, but they can act as a fomite. So if foot and mouth disease was diagnosed in the US, there are a variety of tools for controlling spread, which are listed here on the slide. The state and federal steps include stopping movement of animals and their products for a period of time. We know that exports will also stop. Animals known to be infected may be stamped out or depopulated. Animals that are suspicious of having the disease could be tested, and then emergency vaccination may also be used. The producer really has some control over the disease within their herd or within their operation. The first is implementing biosecurity over their herd or flock regarding animal movements, people, supplies, equipment, other things. They get to decide how much risk they're willing to take when it comes to disease spread. In a foot and mouth disease outbreak, it is the producer's responsibility to implement these biosecurity protocols to protect their herd from exposure. Keeping records is also important to know if their animals may have been exposed, so that trace forward, trace back. Monitoring sheep for disease becomes even more important in an FMD outbreak because they don't show signs as well. All of these are more complicated for ranchers with livestock grazing public lands. So this project really wanted to uncover the several nuances to livestock grazing public lands, and then also develop some guidance criteria to address those nuances. So movement restrictions of susceptible livestock species is one strategy for the control and containment of foreign animal disease during a US outbreak. The 72-hour national movement standstill of susceptible species, semen, embryos, and wool has been recommended by USDA during state and national exercises. During this time, regulatory control areas around infected premises will be designated, and the infected, suspect, and contact farms will be managed under the guidance of the various red books or response plans. Livestock operations affected by movement restrictions yet not infected with the FAD will need to restart movement as soon as possible to support business continuity that is consistent with mitigating the risk of disease spreading. The guidance in the secure food supply plans are for operations with no evidence of the foreign animal disease infection located in the control area to prepare to meet movement permit requirements while reducing the risk of spreading the virus. Within the USDA APHIS foot and mouth disease response plan, there are movement and control area guidelines. Susceptible species will be quarantined. Movement will be by permit issued only and based on risk. These movement controls will be in place until the control area is released. The secure food supply plans are business continuity options for operations that are, again, affected by the movement controls, but not infected with FMD. So why is this guidance needed for ranchers with cattle and sheep grazing federal public lands? So these grazing livestock may be in a regulatory control area with an infected sheep flock, cattle herd, and/or wildlife, which puts the livestock at risk of FMD virus exposure. Also, the rancher's base property may be in a regulatory control area, and those livestock may need to leave the federal public lands because they have either reached the end of their grazing season, there might be a natural disaster like wildfire, flood, or a pending blizzard, and for those reasons, the animals may not be able to go home. The importance of contingency planning for those situations led to the need for this project. This project built on the guidance of the secure food supply plans that have already been developed. These are only 7 to 10 pages long and can be found on their respective websites. Each provides guidance to producers, packers, and processors, regulatory officials, and veterinarians for preparedness and response actions to promote business continuity during a U.S. transboundary animal disease outbreak. The SBS and the SSWS plans now have guidance related to livestock grazing federal public lands, both on the websites. The secure food supply plans include permit guidance because in a foot and mouth disease outbreak, movement permits will be required for susceptible livestock and germplasm leaving, going into, or traveling within a control area. This project started with the outbreak movement permit guidance found in the secure sheep and wool supply and secure beef supply continuity of business plans, as shown on the screen. There are nuances for ranchers with livestock grazing public lands. For instance, it is assumed that no semen or embryos will be moved out into or within public lands because this is an uncommon or rare management practice during the grazing season. There were additional modifications that will be covered later in the presentation. So that's our overview of foot and mouth disease and the need for this project. I'm going to pass it on to Caitlin Glover to talk about public land grazing.
Thanks so much, Dr. Herman. As she mentioned, I'm Caitlin Glover. I am the Executive Director of the Public Lands Council. We are the organization who represents the interests of cattle and sheep producers who hold these federal grazing permits across federal lands. So Dr. Herman talked to you a little bit about the need and some of the gaps that were identified in prior planning activities. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about not only sort of the construct that this group was working through, but also the geographies as well. When we are looking at a map of the United States, you're going to see here on the western portion of the United States a significant number of various color-coded areas. While public lands exist in a number of places across the country, like national parks and national monuments, this project is focused on Bureau of Land Management, or BLM lands, and U.S. Forest Service lands in that sort of mid-brown and light green color, respectively. You're seeing a significant portion of those exist in the 11 western states where federal lands are so heavily concentrated. And these lands are the ones that typically have the greatest density of public lands grazing. They have high quality forage. They have a high number of spaces and of public grazing permittees. They have fewer population centers because these states tend to be more rural. We'll talk a little bit in a moment about the scope, but BLM manages across these western states about 245 million surface acres. Forest Service has about 193, and they both have regulations that manage these grazing activities. Grazing is managed on a per head basis. Grazing permittees pay a fee per head in order to graze on these landscapes and incorporate them into their management practices with private land. It's important to note that BLM lives in the Department of the Interior, while Forest Service lives in the Department of Agriculture. And so with these partners as part of this discussion, there were a number of departments bringing their own regulations and their own perspectives to our discussion. When we're looking at the state land ownership, I think the jurisdictional pieces are particularly important. Julie was talking about, Dr. Herman was talking a little bit about some of the different authorities. And when we look at the administration of grazing activities and disease prevention across the West, it's quite clear that we need to engage those federal agencies, not just because of the authorities that they have on these landscapes, but also because of the sheer volume. Potentially with the exception of Alaska, we see it number 4 here, that's simply a difference of agricultural production. The top 11 states with the greatest federal footprint are all of the western states that have federal lands grazing. And so when we're thinking about disease prevention or containment, or really any other factor that deals with economic development, the need to involve the agencies is clear. Whether you're talking about Nevada, where there's 80% of their surface area is owned or managed by the federal government, even down to Washington or Montana with 28 and 29% respectively, this decision matrix and those jurisdictional boundaries pose significant challenges, not only for grazing permittees, but also in the tools that are available. Dr. Herman talked a little bit about movement permits, and perhaps this is a great place to talk a little bit about the terminology that the state land ownership, the federal land ownership, and the contrast of these management scenarios for permittees that arise from that. When we're talking about the area of grazing management, we're talking about allotments. We're talking about areas that have been identified for grazing activities that are administered under a grazing permit. This group spent a lot of time discussing permits, not only movement permits and that would allow for the conveyance of animals, but also grazing permits, the documents that authorize grazing activities on these respective lands. These allotments are contiguous units that are managed under that grazing permit structure and are considered the unit that we're trying to manage in a disease or even a general management scenario. An animal unit month is the measure of livestock engagement with the landscape. The animal unit month is the amount of forage that's necessary to sustain 1 AUM, a cow or a cow-calf pair, 5 sheep, based on the forage that they intake on an annual basis. Or on a monthly basis. And also when we're talking about base property, this is in contrast to the allotment. So the allotment is the federal land. The base property is the private land held by those grazing permittees that ties their grazing activity to a private asset. That base property is their home farm, their home place where they can not only derive forage for their livestock, but also register and carry out their business activities. So once you have the terminology and you understand really the geography of where this grazing is located, the scope is particularly important. We have about 245 million acres managed by the BLM in total, 193 million acres managed by the Forest Service. Of those large numbers, at the Department of the Interior, 155 million acres are available for grazing activities and 96 million at the Forest Service. These numbers continue to whittle down, and so we've seen in the last few years that a portion of those 155 and 96 respectively are actually permitted to the tune of 139 million acres at the Department of the Interior's BLM and 74 million acres on the Forest Service side. So of those grazing activities, of those acres that are actively grazed, those allotments, you see them managed through about 23,000 federal grazing permits. And here's where I think is particularly important to note, not only the geography, but the scope of engagement with the rest of the industry. Dr. Herman identified the animals that are inside the scope of an FAD or an FMD investigation and prevention plan. But when we're talking about the cattle and sheep industries, a significant portion not only of the Western beef herd, 60% of the beef cattle in these Western states spend some time on federal land, but 53% of the national breeding herd of ewes, of sheep, spend time on federal land. These lands are incredibly valuable for the forage that they provide. It's a significant number of livestock, and it's a significant number of private land operations and base properties that are engaged as well. And so when we think about grazing permits, just breaking it down a little bit further, for the BLM and for the Forest Service, it's important to note that these permits and the allotments aren't necessarily on a one-to-one basis. You may have a permittee who has a permit that covers several allotments. So there are a number of allotments implicated in some of these grazing permit activities. And these number of permits also fluctuate on a year-to-year basis due to grazing conditions and forage availability. In 2022 and fiscal year 2022, we saw about 18,000 permits for the BLM, approximately 6,000 permits for the Forest Service. In fiscal 22, that equated to about 12.3 animal unit months for the BLM and about 6.6 million AUMs for the Forest Service. You will note that both federal agencies report their AUMs to also include other animals, non-cattle and sheep, but the vast majority of these grazing activities on federal land and the vast majority of these AUMs are the cattle and sheep grazing industries represented by NCBA and by our friends at ASI as well. So with this basic understanding of some of the federal lands parameters, geographies, and some of the terminology, I'm going to turn to my colleague Erica Sanko from the American Sheep Industry Association for her perspective.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. Appreciate it very much. So at this point in time, we'll delve into the movement criteria. I'm Erica Sanko. As mentioned, I'm with the American Sheep Industry Association. I am the program lead for the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan, and as the primary grant recipient, the lead for this project. So the scope of this NADPRP funded project was for sheep and cattle grazing public lands that are not infected, suspect, or in contact with infected herds or flocks. We did not address depopulation of infected animals or vaccination. Those items were outside the scope of this project. The focus was on sheep and cattle herds that were in a control area and need a permit to move, or move onto an allotment, turning out onto an allotment, possibly moving from another pasture or allotment during the grazing season, back onto private lands, back to the home ranch, or maybe movement within the same state or different states. There were three main objectives for this project. The first and the most important was to create an advisory group representing public land grazing stakeholder interests to contribute to, review, and exercise guidance documents and promote awareness within their respective industry or agency segment. The second objective was to develop guidance documents for sheep and cattle grazing federal public land allotments that addresses managing exposure risks and provide actionable details necessary to guide industry and decision makers on animal movement strategies during an FMD outbreak and make them available on both the Secure Sheep and Wool and Beef Supply plans. And then finally, the third objective was to conduct two different discussion-based exercises, a seminar followed by a workshop to create the interjurisdictional guidance and then obtain consensus on an effective animal movement plan to or from federal public land grazing in an FMD control area that aligns with the goals of the USDA FMD response plan and the Secure Food Supply plans. So as mentioned, the first objective was to create an advisory group representing our stakeholder interests involved in the public land grazing segment of the sheep and cattle industries. And I would say this was the most important objective and the most successful objective that was completed in this project. We had ranchers representing 22,000 grazing permittees. Those ranchers, 7 were involved. They were from Colorado, Montana, North Dakota, New Mexico, Nevada, Oregon, and Utah. We had the federal land management agencies, Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service. And as Caitlin already discussed, why we focused with those 2 agencies. The wildlife agencies, USDA Wildlife Services, and then U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. We had 3 state animal health officials from California, Colorado, and Nevada. Of course, USDA APHIS Veterinary Services, and then the 3 associations, ASI, NCBA, and the Public Lands Council. The group was assembled in April of 2022, and we started with virtual meetings. The second objective was to develop guidance documents for sheep and cattle grazing public land allotments that addresses managing exposure risks. To do this, our consultant conducted interviews with our advisory group ranchers to learn about normal management practices and answer questions about FMD virus spread and control. She also interviewed 2 FMD experts, one here in the US and one in the UK, to learn what countries with nomadic populations of sheep and cattle have done to manage outbreaks and the challenges we needed to be aware of. All this information was compiled into a document titled Management Practices and FMD Exposure Risks for Sheep and Cattle Grazing Federal Public Lands. Now, our consultant also interviewed the advisory group agency representatives to learn more about and document the non-outbreak and the outbreak permitting responsibilities and how these agencies are going to interact with wildlife agencies. This too was compiled into a document titled Roles of Agencies in Non-Outbreak and FMD Outbreak Situations Permitting Sheep and Cattle Grazing Public Lands. Now, in talking about the management practices and FMD exposure risks for sheep and cattle grazing public lands, that document that was compiled is only 7 pages, but it's packed with a lot of information. The advisory group reviewed and discussed this document via webinars before coming together during their first seminar in November 2022. And that document covers FMD exposure risks, such as what's the presence of wild and feral animals? What are the management practices that are common when grazing on an allotment versus on a home ranch? What's the contact? What's the possibility for monitoring disease? And the most important thing, which was already alluded to, was terminology. What's the terminology that's going to be used to increase communication and understanding between ranchers and decision makers? The other document, roles of agencies in non-outbreak and FMD outbreak situations permitting sheep and cattle grazing on public lands, is also 7 pages, more by coincidence, and it describes the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, USDA APHIS, and the state's roles with respect to public land and disease response management. Again, the group also reviewed and discussed this document quite extensively on a webinar prior to coming together to their first seminar in November of 2022. So as mentioned, one of the first virtual meetings with the advisory group was to review the various roles and responsibilities. As mentioned, Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service, they issue public land grazing permits to producers in peacetime. USDA APHIS is the federal agency that has jurisdiction over the management of foreign animal disease outbreaks. State animal health officials work in a unified command with USDA during foreign animal disease outbreaks. They are the ones that have the quarantine authority for infected or at-risk livestock premises and set the movement criteria for outbreaks. The various agencies involved in federal public land grazing and FMD outbreak management is complex, as you're probably getting a sense of in today's webinar. Bringing these agencies together to discuss jurisdictional oversight was a huge accomplishment and success of this project. Early discussions identified several challenges to be addressed. There are certain times a year when animals must be moved onto or off of a federal public land allotment, whether due to be weather changes. Is it May? Is it November? What's the availability of forage on those allotments? Are there management needs? Are we moving into breeding or lambing seasons? Natural disasters, potential wildfire outbreaks, wildlife interactions. We have protected species, grizzlies, wolves that we have to deal with on the federal public land allotments, and a bunch of other factors that are outside the control of the livestock owners, for example, a foot-and-mouth disease outbreak. Likewise, controlling access and separating flocks and herds or moving on or off public lands are out of the producer's control during an outbreak. They must work through the state and or federal land management agency or agencies, because many producers graze sheep or cattle on both type of BLM or U.S. Forest Service allotments. They may have both. In addition to the state and federal regulatory officials managing the outbreak to put protections in place for their livestock. So as mentioned, our group came together for a seminar in November of 2022. We met at the NCBA offices in Denver. And using the resources developed, various movement situations were presented by our facilitator, Danelle Beckett-Waddell of Preventalytics. We had 19 advisory group members present to discuss the options, challenges, and identified gaps. The discussion-based exercise addressed 4 objectives through presentations and movement scenarios. This seminar was an opportunity to build and strengthen the relationships between our agency personnel that will manage the FMD response, agency personnel that manage federal public lands, and our ranchers who rely on public land grazing to feed their livestock. Through their efforts, a movement decision criteria document was created, and this was the focus of the next discussion-based exercise, a workshop. So the workshop was held in August of 2023. We met back at the NCBA offices. We had most everybody in attendance, but we also had 4 attendees virtually. And I will add, between November of 2022 and August in 2023, our advisory group met multiple times, more webinars, and a lot of email discussions as well. So the advisory group worked through movement scenarios using the guidance in that movement strategies document. Of course, additional gaps were identified, and the group prioritized additional resources, and they reached consensus on 3 movement options and 5 movement decision criteria. We also determined additional deliverables to help ranchers and decision makers. And then the advisory group also discussed next steps to finalize and release these guidance documents, plus create additional resources. So delving into that document, the guidance document describes, as I mentioned, 3 movement options and 5 decision criteria for our industry and regulatory officials to consider when managing cattle and sheep grazing federal public lands that, again, are affected by movement controls, quarantined or in a control area, but are not infected with foot and mouth disease during an outbreak here in the US. Now, this does not apply to tribal lands. That was out of the scope of this project. And again, it is guidance only. It aligns with the USDA FMD response plan released in 2020, and it's cognizant of our Bureau of Land Management and US Forest Service jurisdiction. It refers to the Code of Federal Regulations, instructional memorandums, manuals, and directives. These are all included in the appendices so that references to them in the document can be readily reviewed in the same document, make it a little bit more efficient. So as I mentioned, 3 movement options for grazing public lands that are not considered infected, suspect, or contact in a control area include: first option, staying in place until the control area movement restrictions are lifted. The second option is moving to a location within that control area. And finally, the third option is moving outside of the control area to a biosecure location that can quarantine livestock away from susceptible species. Now, the 5 decision criteria that the group came to consensus on to ensure animal needs and response goals are below. These will require interagency collaboration for an effective response. So those 5 decision criteria, the first is assessing availability, suitability, and adequate feed and water. That means, what is the weather condition? What time of year are we in? How much forage and water is available? Extending stays on federal public lands. If we're in the fall and we're ending that term period on that allotment, can a stay be extended on that public land? What's the provisions for feed and water? Some allotments, there's requirements as to supplemental feeding, what is allowed and what is not allowed. Monitoring for disease. Can active observational surveillance take place? Can off-road or motor vehicle use be used to conduct surveillance for disease monitoring? There are restrictions on some allotments regarding vehicle use. And what about setting up corrals within allotments? So how can we do some monitoring for disease? Mitigating with interactions with wildlife. What's the situation with FMD and wildlife in that area? How are the state and federal agencies working together to mitigate those interactions? Controlling public access to control areas. These are federal public land allotments. In addition to the livestock, we also have recreationalists. There are other permittees, such as an oil or natural gas and mining, who has the control to manage public access in those areas. And then implementing just-in-time biosecurity. So moving into that just-in-time biosecurity, in the current secure sheep and wool supply and secure beef supply plans, enhanced biosecurity checklists and templates, they were originally written for producers who could control access to private lands, to their home ranch, their base ranch. Those checklists and templates, they don't align with federal public land nuances, since controlling access, separating flocks and herds, and limiting wildlife contact are pretty much out of the individual rancher's control. So the goal of enhanced biosecurity is to prevent disease exposure of livestock in a control area. And this will require collaboration with the land management agencies and wildlife agencies involved in the response. Once notified their livestock are in a control area, ranchers could be provided with the just-in-time biosecurity and exposure questionnaire for FMD livestock grazing on public lands, which is shown here on the screen. This is a template that was created specifically out of this project for this livestock population. It's available on the Secure Sheep and Wool and Secure Beef Supply public land grazing web pages. In this document, ranchers can describe how they effectively manage animals in the most biosecure manner in their current location. Officials should be prepared to provide guidance that aligns with feasibility and risk management based on the allotment or pasture location, the climate, time of year, and the travel route. Again, as I mentioned, this resource was developed in collaboration with our ranchers, our state and USDA partners out of this project, and it has been tested by our ranchers as well. The FMD response plan describes the national movement standstill, which was mentioned earlier in today's webinar. The public lands guidance suggests states with livestock moving to, on, or from federal public lands for grazing should consider the following when writing state-specific standstill orders. Susceptible animals already on the road when the standstill goes into effect are considered in transit and should be allowed to continue to their destination. So animals moving between a premise, public lands, whether that be on hoof, trailing is how we refer to it, or in trucks or trailers. Livestock trailed on hoof may take longer than the proposed 12-hour grace period to reach their destination and should be allowed to continue to move to meet feed and water needs. Animal welfare is a priority. Other considerations that the states should also consider include livestock moving between continuous pastures and allotments on federal public land should be allowed to continue to move unless they are trailing towards a known infected or suspect premise, such as an infected herd or flock. Cattle and sheep trailed on hoof that maintain separation when passing by other livestock holdings should be allowed to continue to move to meet feed and water needs. There may be limited cellular and internet service in the areas where ranchers are trailing or grazing livestock. Ranchers may not be immediately informed of the grace period or the start of the standstill. In sparsely populated livestock areas, so long as livestock are not encroaching upon an infected herd or flock or wildlife, ceasing movement may not mitigate a risk exposure. So permitting movements in an outbreak. As we've been building upon the secure sheep and wool supply and secure beef supply plan framework, the movement decision criteria guidance includes Table 1, which applies to sheep and cattle grazing federal public lands located within an FMD control area that can be observed and or tested within the control area, as noted under no evidence of infection. So the Table 1 that was referenced earlier by Dr. Herman, we have made modifications onto those tables, and those modifications are noted in bold and underlined. The first of those is given the number of federal land allotments and pastures, premise identification numbers would not be pre-assigned to ranchers before an outbreak. Rather, initial traceability info would include the number or name of the allotment or pasture, as those are well defined by Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service documents. And I will add, this was heavily vetted by our advisory group. And the second modification to Table 1 was enhanced biosecurity steps would be described through records like the just-in-time document shown in a few slides previous to this one, interviews or observations. The state and APHIS may have additional requirements based on risk. Movements of animals and animal products during an outbreak will also need to follow all applicable state regulations. We also developed Table 2 as part of the movement decision criteria guidance, which accounts for situations when either sheep or cattle that are grazing federal public lands need to leave an FMD control area to a biosecure location that meets quarantine requirements, meaning no direct or indirect contact with a susceptible species for at least 28 days. And this may be due to one of those 5 criteria that we mentioned: feed and water availability. Maybe there's an inability to monitor for disease, or any of the other criteria that was mentioned. The request for moving live animals from a control area may trigger a risk analysis, assessing the situation, such as exposure risks, what's the monitoring status, transport method, is it by hoof, trailing, or is it by truck or trailer, or a combination, and the route and the destination. So this will help determine the best way to mitigate the risk of the disease spread. We do encourage ranchers to have a contingency plan for locations that could meet this criteria in case of an FMD outbreak. As a result of this project, a section on grazing public lands has been included in the biosecurity checklist, an information manual for pasture and rangeland on both templates. We have both a type and a write-in template for for the user's preference. And the continuity of business plans were also updated with this information. And ensuring transparency in all of our edits, a summary of changes is available on both the Secure Beef and Secure Sheep and Wool Supply websites, and all of the documents that have been updated are dated as of last month. Now, the feedlot biosecurity checklist and information manuals remain unchanged as they were not impacted by this project. Ranchers with base property are strongly encouraged to develop an enhanced biosecurity plan for that premise using the species appropriate enhanced biosecurity resources. So in addition to these resources, we also encourage our producers to develop their enhanced biosecurity plans for their private or home ranch. The ultimate goals of this project are to prepare sheep and cattle producers whose livestock graze public lands with the information and actions needed during a foot and mouth disease outbreak to protect their flocks and herds and meet movement criteria. Also to minimize the impact on our livestock industries during an outbreak. All of these resources were posted to the Secure Sheep and Wool and Secure Beef Supply websites in February of this year. Another goal, and a very important goal, is the guidance will also prepare our decision makers with a better understanding of the management practices, capabilities, and limitations of this industry segment. There is a promotional video in development. Once complete, it will be posted in the Secure Sheep and Wool and Secure Beef Supply public land grazing web pages, and that video will be posted here in the next few weeks. At this time, I will turn it over to our advisory member to give us a state perspective of this project.
Good morning, good afternoon, whatever the case may be. Thank you guys. Dr. JJ Goycochea, Director, Nevada Department of Agriculture. Actually on the road today, out here in some of our public lands. I just want to go over real quick some of the things that I think are important to a lot of us permittees and a lot of us agency folks out here in the West. First of all, you guys heard these individuals talking about we're going to be moving our herds. We may be moving them on foot or we may be hauling them. In Nevada, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, a lot of our Western states, we also have multiple species that we may be moving at the same time. So that's really important to keep in mind. You guys are going to want a really good relationship with those permittees. If you are one of those permittees, you've got to get along with your neighbor. I know that doesn't always work, but it's going to be critical in this. We're going to have a lot of partners as we go forward. You're going to have local law enforcement involved. You're going to have emergency management folks from the state involved in this. So I think my one take-home message for everybody on this as we go forward, make sure you have those relationships set early. Have that good relationship with your veterinarian. Make sure you at least know someone at your Department of Agriculture, know someone locally, so that as we start reaching out and we have those contacts with you, that you're comfortable in having those conversations. And probably one of the most critical things, make sure your information is up to date, whether that's with the BLM, that's with the Forest Service, that's with our government, our non-governmental organizations, ASI, PLC, NCBA, and also with your state agencies. When a Department of Agriculture sends you something and says, hey, we want to make sure your contact information is up to date, this is why we are looking for that. We don't want to have to be tracking down cell phone numbers, emails, and that kind of thing. So I know that we're kind of getting short on time here, and so I don't want to take a lot of time. I just want to leave everyone with this isn't if, it's when. And so the more we can do to prepare, the more you guys can dig into these documents, share those documents with those that are going to be affected, and start to really get a plan in place, the better off we're going to be. So I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to participate in that. We had a really good group. We came together, we ribbed on each other quite a bit, but there were a lot of things that I don't think one individual or even 5 individuals would have thought about. It was a good, diverse group, and this is going to be a wonderful work product. Thank you.
Thank you, JJ. I am Dr. Danelle Bickett-Weddle. I had the extreme honor to be the consultant on this project. And if you could get CE for anything, I think it would be wonderful. Dr. Don Beckett is the area veterinarian in charge with USDA APHIS. Could not be with us live today. Since my name was closest to his, I got designated to share his perspective. But Don wanted to let everybody know he thought this was a fantastic learning experience. There was great input and knowledge sharing from the producers. He really appreciated the support and the engagement of those other federal partners and the industry organizations. Don really thinks these end products are going to be very helpful as the USDA continues to work on preparedness efforts. When I asked him about, well, what would be a main lesson or a take-home message for his fellow AVICs or other USDA colleagues, he thought really at the end of the day, reaching out to the Forest Service Forest Supervisor, again, for each national forest in your state or states, if you cover multiple, as well as the BLM State Director, and doing this in peacetime, and recommending including those folks in your FMD stop movement exercises or any other exercise opportunities was one way he thought would really increase the awareness and knowledge at a state level. And our group is aware of at least one state and some collaborating states that have put in for a NADPRP proposal to do just that, to take all of this national guidance and apply it to a state. Again, we didn't talk about tribes, we didn't talk about state-owned lands, but some of those things are really, really important at a state level to exercise. So stay tuned, we're hoping that will continue. A great big thank you to USDA NADPRP for funding this project. To all of our advisory group members, I see many of you are on today, and we're just grateful for the darts you threw, the wonderful suggestions you put out there to make this really a guidance document that's going to benefit a lot of folks. Thanks to ASI, thanks to NCBA, and thanks to PLC for your leadership and being kind of champions behind all of this so that we could come up with some of these recommendations in peacetime. So if you go to the homepage of Secure Beef or Secure Sheep and Wool websites, you will see the icons on the screen in front of you, and those are links to those public land resources. So again, just a great big thank you for bringing together our ranchers, our agencies that manage public land grazing to create these resources. Liz, we'll turn it to you for questions.
All right, thanks everyone. We do have a couple comments / questions in the chat. The first one is, how far through the hierarchy of the agencies has this guidance been distributed? Is it only at the Washington level, or has it been distributed and discussed down to the district level? Inter and intra-agency communication is often challenging.
As Erica pointed out, these resources were released in February of 2024. And one of the last things we did at our last workshop was to brainstorm how do we get it out far and wide. So all of our agency partners that have been involved with this, and Steve Gibson, thank you for sharing the perspective on Forest Service in the chat, is their goal was to get this out. And so one of the reasons why we're doing this webinar is to go through the parts and pieces and encourage people to go to those resources and be more aware. So this is kind of phase one of that outreach. And then it's really up to people that are going to be impacted and affected by it to spread it far and wide. Erica, if you want to share what ASI is doing?
Well, I just wanted to share, that was the key part of bringing the advisory group together, was making sure that those members were willing to not only engage in the discussions during the project, but carry this message forward. So Steve Gibson, who was on our advisory committee, has already shared that, how it's circulating through the Forest Service. We're also having conversations with our partners in CBA, Public Lands Council, our state associations. How can we share this information to their federal public land agencies on a state level? Are there meetings that take place? Last year, we had the opportunity to attend quite a few of the public land grazing meetings throughout different states in the Western US. A few of us were there to present. We also had handouts to provide, because there were a lot of agency folks more at the state and regional levels at those meetings. So we're continuing to have those conversations. How do we continue to share the information, get that outreach to the different agencies? And we're also relying on our advisory group members within those agencies, not just the federal public lands, but of course our state animal health officials and APHIS, to also share this information, and all of you here today on the webinar to spread the information among your colleagues or your segment of the industry.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Oh, let's see, something just came through the chat. Preparedness won't happen magically. What can we do to ensure state departments of ag are properly manned and funded? And how do we effectively encourage producer participation in exercises when there is so much misinformation and mistrust?
Great question. I guess I'll take a first I guess first try at this one. In addition to all of the producer meetings that Erica mentioned, Erica and I are both involved with USAHA, so we are getting our information out to all of those different committees where the state animal health officials are there, and that information is available to them. Each state is run different, and they have different funding, and we realize that is can be a barrier. But trying to provide these resources in a publicly available, free format hopefully provides a way that we can get that out to all of the participants in the chain, so everyone from the producer clear up to USDA.
And Dr. Herman, I might jump in here as well. I think you're right, Leah, that preparedness doesn't happen magically. But the integration of these guidance documents across not only the federal government, but the state government and also producer groups is the best way to take multiple avenues to get toward that preparedness goal. These producers are engaged in state associations who are engaged with their state governments and their state agencies. And so there is so much of this information dispersal that will happen on a really intentional but sort of multifaceted way. It will take multiple points of entry for this guidance and for these relationships to develop and for that trust not only to be built or rebuilt and maintained, but these conversations and having something to coalesce around is often quite helpful.
And I'll just add the American Sheep Industry Association received NADPRP funding to actually do an exercise and partner with one of the states. And that exercise where we actually moved through an outbreak and the guidance not related to public lands, because this project was about a year in and those documents were still being developed and everything was being discussed. That exercise, I say kind of changed how our industry approached preparedness, recognized the importance, and when bringing everybody to the table, the state animal health officials partnering with that state, bringing the association, we brought various agencies, we had a lot of other stakeholders in that room. I'd say that trust and having those open conversations really kind of changed the tune, and we have seen a lot more interest among our state associations, state animal health officials, and our producers in wanting to learn more and start working and preparing, utilizing the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan. And we've had a lot of people in our industry waiting for these guidance documents because of how important the public land segment is to our industry. So I'd say the possibility of putting on exercises, bringing stakeholders to the table will help address some of that trust and misinformation.
Great. There was another comment that said, I've reached out to the Nevada BLM state range lead to discuss the subject. Nobody wants a trespass notice because we're not allowed to move our livestock. I don't know if, Gary, if you want to unmute yourself and discuss that.
Yeah, sure. So I reached out not long ago to Catherine Dyer, who's the state range lead, and she was not aware of it, but she is now taking it to the state leadership team in BLM. But there's all kinds of scenarios that could happen. But if you're on range and you're at your end of your grazing period and you have a lockdown, can't move, BLM issues a non-compliance and trespass notice that you're on range. And so being able to move livestock, or at least have them aware of it, and so that you're not fined, is pretty important. And if you need to go on and you can't go on, that's can be expensive as well. But the agencies, we really need to engage with them. And apparently they don't have to comply with this, but that's going to be imperative to get as much cooperation as possible.
Okay, thank you. And thanks, Danelle, for putting in the links for the public lands page and secure beef page. And she mentioned you can also download all the resources mentioned from those links. So that's very, very helpful. Any other comments, questions?
So I'll just mention real quickly in response to Gary's comment, A lot of discussion also happened as what happens if a producer cannot access their allotment, cannot utilize their allotment in that grazing year, or potentially, and things of that sort. Those who are very familiar with the nuances, there's some, and Caitlin is the one who can delve into it, but for time, we made sure, the advisory group, that producers are not penalized. Producers that graze federal public lands are not penalized in the event of a foot and mouth disease outbreak if they cannot utilize their allotment that year or fully use their allotment that year. And there's a lot of discussion of what happens when you're at that end of your allotment. How are these agencies going to work together? Which is why we have worked so hard to get consensus on those movement criteria. What would be those three? Stay in place, move within, or move off to a biosecure location, and those criteria guidance, with animal welfare being very high priority. And again, one of the key priorities is our producers are not penalized in the event of foot and mouth disease outbreak, because grazing on federal public land has so many nuances and things that are out of their control.